Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Gears of War Judgment for Xbox 360. This is a third-person shooter, the fourth entry in the Gears of War franchise, and up until the announcement of Gears of War E-Day, it was the first game in the series chronologically because it takes place before the events of the original Gears of War. However, now that Gears of War E-Day exists, it is the second game in the series chronologically. It was developed as a collaborative effort by People Can Fly, a studio most well known for Painkiller and Bulletstorm, as well as Epic Games, although People Can Fly was the lead developer on the project, and it was published by Microsoft in March of 2013 exclusively for Xbox 360. And while the game was pretty decently received critically, it sold rather poorly, especially compared to the previous Gears of War game, which was Gears of War 3. And to give you an idea of the kind of disparity we're talking about here, Gears of War Judgment sold about 425,000 copies in its first month, and about 1 million by the end of its first year. Whereas Gears of War 3 apparently sold about 3 million copies in its first week. Even compared to the original Gears of War, that's pretty dismal numbers. I mean, the original Gears of War apparently sold about 1 million copies within the first 2 weeks, so sales for Gears of War Judgment were pretty dismal by comparison, and that begs the question as to why. What happened with Gears of War Judgment that made people just not pick it up? Well, there were two, shall we call them, environmental factors that definitely contributed to it. The first is that there were just general economic concerns at the time, so that was going to affect the game industry regardless, and it was something we saw industry-wide. It wasn't just Gears of War Judgment affected by it. The other thing was that the new consoles, the Xbox One and PlayStation 4, would release later in the same year. So a fair few gamers were also just saving their money for the new consoles. But while both of those things affected the sales of Gears of War Judgment, it was ultimately Gears of War Judgment itself that resulted in those poor sales. So what happened there? How could a game in a major franchise like Gears of War do well critically but sell so poorly and ultimately become effectively the forgotten Gears of War game? Well, let's just go ahead and delve right in and find out. And like always, we'll go ahead and start with presentation. Now, much like this game's predecessors, it runs on Unreal Engine 3, and it's used to pretty solid effect for the later part of the Xbox 360's lifespan. The modeling, texture quality, and special effects are all quite solid, although this does have the typical problem of console shooters of the time, and actually console shooters in general, of applying very heavy blurring effects, especially motion blur, that you obviously cannot turn off, making it look like you've smeared your screen in petroleum jelly half the time. Now, this was done for mainly two reasons. The first is a sort of cinematic effect. You see this kind of thing in movies quite often, and they wanted to apply similar effects in video games, both first and third-person shooters, and even just action games in general, to give a sense of fast cinematic motion, but it was also done to help mask the game's frame rate. You see, if you slather the game in motion blurring effects, it makes it seem like it's moving faster than it actually is, which is maxing out at 30 frames per second. I say maxing out because it very, very frequently dips below 30 frames per second, well down into the 20s, and that starts to affect your gameplay in ways that motion blur is not able to obscure. The choppiness of the frame rate ends up making it more difficult to maneuver, more difficult to react, and more difficult to aim. And while that sort of thing was entirely commonplace in the Xbox 360 and PS3 generation, it's really not acceptable. In effect, they were trying to sacrifice the game's playability in favor of squeezing out some extra visuals that, frankly, people weren't going to be impressed by anyway, because it was the Xbox 360 and people already knew what it was capable of. There wasn't really anything visually Gears of War Judgment was doing that Gears of War 3 hadn't already done 2 years earlier, and people had already been exposed to the kind of visuals they would be seeing on Xbox One and PlayStation 4, so something like Gears of War Judgment would have been better served by just toning down the visuals somewhat in order to get the game to a more stable, much smoother frame rate and not sacrifice its playability. And then, of course, there are the problems generally associated with Unreal Engine 3 games, and Gears of War in particular, of the game being extremely brown and gray. I'm not going to do the whole brown and gray and realistic bit, because it's definitely not remotely realistic. It's a sci-fi game. But the general lack of color this game has is certainly in keeping with the rest of the Gears of War franchise, but by the time this game came out in 2013, it was just incredibly tiresome. It was just something that absolutely plagued that era of gaming, where games just had to be brown and gray and basically nothing else. There is a bit of green, and obviously there's plenty of red with all the blood and gore in the game. But with this game being set only a few weeks after Emergence Day, you would expect that all of the incredibly post-apocalyptic stuff that we saw from Gears of War 1, 2, and 3 wouldn't have really set in yet, and there would be more color. Instead, there's one level where you get some gold highlights on the environment, and that's kinda it. And then there's a level where you're going through an upper class neighborhood and there's some green with the foliage that's growing in the environment, but that's pretty much it too. Even in those environments, it's incredibly gray with some brown here and there, and for the rest of the game, you're dealing with almost exclusively brown and gray with a few small touches of color here and there that just results in everything looking really bland. And of course, while it's reasonable to expect there will be plenty of asset reuse in this from Gears of War 3, that certainly doesn't help matters. Then you move over into sound design, where things stay more or less the same as they were in the previous Gears of War games. Most of the sound effects are just reused or slightly touched up variants of sound effects that were in previous Gears of War games, particularly of course Gears of War 3, and so they're still fairly decent overall, with a few being a bit more standout than the others, like the shotgun sounds, although none of them are still quite as really beefy and concussive as I'd like. Then of course there's the soundtrack, which is still kind of at odds with what's going on in the gameplay, because it's still trying to be a fairly serious orchestral war/horror soundtrack, and yet the actual game itself is utterly ridiculous and full of attempts at quips and one-liners, so it just doesn't really fit. Then you take a look at the voice acting, and characters who return from previous entries in the series of course have their same voice actors, and everybody does a pretty solid job with it. Thankfully, they don't attempt to try to push some sort of heavily emotional storytelling and judgment like they tried to do in previous games in the series and utterly failed at, but yet again, the actors were let down by the game's writing. So when you bring all of it together, you end up with presentation roughly on par with what we had in Gears of War 3, with the main exception there being the game's performance, which is quite a bit worse. But of course, what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, and the story in this is split into two sections. The first is the Judgment campaign, which is the main campaign of this game, and the second is a side story mini-campaign called Aftermath. We'll start with the Judgment campaign, which takes place a few weeks after Emergence Day, or E-Day, where the Locust Horde invaded the surface and began to wage war against humanity on a global scale. And while the main protagonist of both the Judgment and Aftermath campaigns is Damon Baird, you'll be playing as multiple characters throughout the Judgment campaign as they all tell their story, because most of the campaign takes place in flashbacks. The idea here is that Damon and his squad, Kilo Squad, are all being put on military trial by Colonel Loomis, and they have to give testimony about what they did leading up to this trial, and thus gradually reveal why they're on trial in the first place. Aside from Baird, the other members of Kilo Squad are returning character Augustus Coltrane Cole, as well as Cadet Sophia Hendrick and former Major of the Union of Independent Republics Garen Paddock, who is now a private in the COG military. By the way, I don't think I've mentioned it yet, but can we just appreciate how stupid some of the names in the Gears of War series are? I mean, COG stands for Coalition of Ordered Governments. Ordered governments? As opposed to what? Order is the entire point of a government. It's implicit in the idea of a government. It's like if someone described a sedan to you as a car vehicle. Like, yeah, okay, it's a car. You don't need to say it's a vehicle too. The vehicle part is implied in car. And Union of Independent Republics? I mean, it's not quite as bad as Coalition of Ordered Governments, but it's still pretty dumb. Look, I get it. They wanted to do the whole gear in the machine of war thing, so they had, oh, well, the soldiers are named Gears. We're gonna stick with this theme, so What's associated with gears? Well, I guess cogs, which are basically the same thing. Ugh, but anyway, point is, they were going for a motif, so they didn't really care what it stood for, and they ended up with something really stupid that they've had to stick with ever since, and it only seems to get dumber as time goes on. Anyway, back to the actual story here. Those are your four main protagonists in the Judgment campaign. You got Baird, Cole, Paddock, and Sophia, and the perspective switches between them as they're giving their various testimonies to Colonel Loomis. And these testimonies follow Kilo Squad as they fight their way through the Locust hordes during the Battle of Halvo Bay, and eventually they run across a particularly big, nasty enemy called Karn, who is a major ranking figure in the Locust horde, and who appears to be effectively indestructible. Paddock talks about how his men threw everything they had at Karn and just were not able to beat him, so you apparently need drastic measures, and you come to find out that there is a light mass missile hidden in a secret facility in Halvo Bay, and so Hilo Squad ultimately ends up going after that to try to take down Karn with it. When they bring this up with Colonel Loomis, he orders them not to do that because apparently High Command has other plans for the light mass missile. But of course, Baird and the rest of Kilo Squad are pretty convinced that that is the only way they're going to be able to stop Karn, so they defy Loomis's orders and go after the light mass missile and do end up launching it at Karn. Loomis promptly has them arrested and put on trial for defying his orders, and that's it. That's the entire backstory leading up to the trial scene. Oh, and something I didn't mention earlier is that this trial is being held in the middle of an active battle, while the courthouse is under attack by Locust forces, and there is fighting happening literally right outside the doors to the courtroom that they're currently in. And Loomis does not care. He just sits there, calmly, just looking at all this stuff. His soldiers express the utter ridiculousness of this situation, saying, look, we can have the trial later. Right now, we're in the middle of a battle. We need to be focusing on that. And Loomis doesn't care. He doesn't care about the lives of his men. He doesn't care about the lives of the people of Halvo Bay. He doesn't care about winning the war. Apparently, the only thing he actually cares about is that, damn it, someone defied his orders, so he's going to put them on a sham trial, and then afterwards, he's going to shoot them himself. The problems with this are many, the first of which being that it is utterly ridiculous that a commanding officer who had combat experience prior to this would just drop everything they're doing in the middle of a battle in order to hold a military tribunal while there is an active battle going on right outside the doors of the courtroom the tribunal is being held in. There is absolutely no realm of reality or fiction in which this makes sense. The second issue is that the way the story is told just doesn't really work the way the developers probably hoped it did. They probably thought they were being really clever with the whole multiple perspectives thing, but in reality you don't actually get different perspectives. You get a different narrator and you play as a different character during the sections that they're narrating, but all four characters are telling an entirely linear story. Loomis just stops them in the middle of it and then tells the next one to pick up where the other one left off. So it's not like you're playing through a section of the story and one character narrating it is entirely embellishing everything and it's utterly ridiculous, and then somebody else tells the same story, but it's the real story, very by the book, and it's much more watered down or anything like that. It's just one story told in a linear fashion with the narrator changing between sections and really nothing else. So rather than the extremely linear story being told in an extremely linear fashion and just flowing from beginning to end, it's an extremely linear story told in an extremely linear manner with brief interruptions so they can change the narrator and nothing else. And while you can certainly appreciate the attempt to tell the story in a different, more unique way than the previous games, it just doesn't work. And then the other big problem with this story is that it tries to create narrative tension while also being a prequel. So the developers are telling a story where the threat of execution is looming over Kilo Squad throughout the entire trial, even though anybody who's played any of the previous Gears of War games knows that Baird and Cole were both alive as of the events of Gears of War 1, and Judgment takes place years before the events of Gears of War 1, So there's no conceivable way that Baird or Cole can die at the very least. The only members of the squad who might die are Sophia and Paddock, both of whom were introduced in this game, and of the two, the only one who's even the slightest bit interesting is Paddock. And when I say slightest bit interesting, I really do mean that, because none of the characters in Gears of War Judgment are particularly good. As is the norm for Gears of War, they're all quite one-note, one-dimensional characters whose sole defining trait is that they're all just meatheads that fight stuff all the time. But one thing that is rather odd about the way these characters are portrayed in Judgment is that pretty much everybody is throwing around at least attempts at quips and one-liners, and it just doesn't work. You see, if this was your introduction to the Gears of War franchise, then you could be forgiven for not really understanding the general vibe of the series. But if you've played previous games, then you understand that it's a series that takes itself way too seriously. It's a series that tries to portray itself as grim, gritty, apocalyptic fiction, and sure, it never really worked the way they were intended because the series is just so utterly ridiculous it's impossible to take seriously. I mean, they have chainsaw bayonets. You can't take that seriously. But the ironic thing about it is that when you drift away from that, like Gears of War Judgment does, and try to throw in more quips and one-liners, try to make it more like just an action movie vibe, then you actually end up losing a lot of the series' identity, and it just ends up being a very odd game as a result. It's just bizarre to think about. Something that is actually a flaw in this series, where it's trying to be taken seriously, but it's completely ridiculous, so you can't take it seriously, is so core to the series' identity that if you either remove that entirely or try to push it more in the ridiculous direction, it just doesn't work. The end result of all of this is that the storyline in the Judgment campaign ends up being a somewhat disjointed mess, and it never really feels like a proper Gears of War game. It feels like some other developer came in and tried to make a Gears of War game their way, and it just didn't really work out. Which shouldn't be surprising, because that's exactly what happened. Again, People Can Fly are the developers best known for the Painkiller franchise as well as Bulletstorm. They are used to making games that are not supposed to be taken seriously, especially with Bulletstorm being the game that was developed 2 years prior to Gears of War Judgment, and you can definitely tell they didn't quite understand the assignment here. And even if you discount the way the story is told and the way it doesn't feel like a Gears of War story, it's just a downright crap storyline, and that means that you're going to be focusing almost exclusively on the gameplay, which is more or less what you would expect from Gears of War, but with a very significant twist added. The stuff you would expect is the typical Gears of War fare. It's a third-person cover-based shooter. You've got your roadie run, which causes the screen to go all haywire because they think that looks cool, but it actually is just disorienting, especially when you're playing at sub-30 frames per second a lot of the time. Aside from that, you got 3 weapon slots, one of them for your grenades, and then the other 2 for your various other weapons, whether it be pistols, shotguns, assault rifles, whatever. And of course, the active reload system returns, where if you time your reload properly, then not only does it reload faster, but you might even get an additional bonus to firepower with the first few rounds of your magazine, or if it's a single shot weapon, with your next shot. You can of course also find heavy weapons occasionally, and those will slow your movement down, but are very powerful, and some of those also have the active reload mechanics, particularly the mortar and the one-shot. And if you go to switch back to one of your other weapons, or you try to melee, then it will drop the heavy weapon, and then you'll be back to whatever you were using previously. Speaking of melee, the execution system returns. You can down enemies and then go up to them and hold down the melee button in order to do an execution finisher, and with the Retro Lancer and the regular Lancer, you can also hold down the melee button to either charge with the Retro Lancer and then impale them with its bayonet, or if you're using the regular Lancer, then you rev up the bayonet and you saw them apart. There's also a clash system where if you rev up your chainsaw bayonet and you go to saw at another enemy who has a chainsaw, then it will go into a quick time button mash event, and if you win that event, then you win the clash and then you successfully chainsaw them. It's all quite straightforward. If you liked it in the previous Gears of War games, you'll probably like it in Judgment as well, although if you're like me and you don't particularly care for that gameplay style, and you especially can't stand playing shooters on console, it's not really going to do a whole lot for you. There's also not really anything to shake up the standard cover-based shooting mechanics that you would expect from Gears of War, except for one section of the game where you're given a walker that you can stomp around in. but that section is very brief. The other thing they do to try to shake up the game is something they call classified missions. So the way this works is that when you're wandering around the levels, you'll see very large, bright red, glowing crimson omens, which is the logo of the Gears of War franchise, the cog with a skull in the middle of it. And when you go up to these and press the interact button, it will give you a briefing saying, oh, well, there was some other bit of the testimony that wasn't included in the report, and it will give you some additional parameters for the next section of gameplay, such as different enemy types spawning in, or there might be smoke that obscures what you're doing, or you might have a challenge to only complete that section with certain weapons, or something along those lines. Now, the narrative justification for this is that if you complete all of the classified missions, then it's the true story of what happened with all the stuff that Loomis left out of his report and so on and so forth, but it really makes no difference in the actual story progression. The problem with the way they've set this up, though, is that you are encouraged to do the classified missions, because if you don't do them, then you don't earn as many stars, and you need to earn at least 40 stars, which is quite easy to do, but you need to earn at least 40 of those in order to unlock the Aftermath mini-campaign. And as far as I can tell, the only way you can get 3 stars on every level is to complete whatever classified mission is in that level. The end result of all this is a gameplay style that really doesn't work very well for Gears of War. It's known for single-player story campaigns in a very linear fashion that take themselves fairly seriously, and that's just not what you get in Gears of War Judgment. Not only does it not take itself very seriously, but it's got these very arcade game style modifiers that you can apply to the levels through the classified missions. It's got this scoring system with stars that contributes to unlocking stuff in the game, including the Aftermath campaign. And all the while, you're getting pop-ups telling you how well you're doing compared to your friends, so you can make it a sort of competition. You're getting pop-ups telling you that you earned a ribbon for completing some in-game task, like getting a triple kill or something like that. And as if the score screen popping up telling you how you did in the previous section wasn't intrusive enough, there's also the pop-ups telling you when you earn a prize box that actively interrupt whatever you were doing. So if you were trying to rev up your chainsaw, for example, and this thing pops up, suddenly you will stop revving up your chainsaw and you'll have to hold the button down again to rev it back up. It is incredibly annoying. I mean, everybody at this point is used to achievement unlocked popping up in pretty much any modern game, whether it's on console or PC, but when you've got stuff popping up that actively interrupts what you were doing, especially if it's in the middle of an intense firefight, then that goes beyond simply being an intrusive UI element that people can get used to and becomes something that is actively irritating. And what's even worse than it just being an irritant is that you can't turn these off. You can't turn any of those notifications off, whether it's the stats compared to your friends, whether it's the prize box notifications, whether it's the ribbon unlocks, whatever it may well be, you cannot turn those off. They will always pop up, and the prize box notifications specifically will always interrupt your gameplay. And while I'm on the subject, what are these prize boxes anyway? What is so important to Gears of War Judgment that it will interrupt your gameplay to notify that you have unlocked one of these prize boxes? They are loot boxes that give you a random cosmetic unlock for multiplayer. That's it. That is all you get from these prize boxes, and apparently People Can Fly thought that they were important enough to Gears of War Judgment that they need to interrupt your gameplay to notify you that you've unlocked one. By the way, the only way you can open them is by going back to the main menu, so I guess they expect you to go, oh, I've unlocked a prize box. I better go back to the main menu and interrupt my campaign gameplay in order to unlock one of these loot boxes and get some random crappy skin for multiplayer. To say this was a misguided gameplay choice is a severe understatement. And you know what the worst part about all this is? Once you get past the intrusive UI, the loot box notifications interrupting your gameplay, the weird arcade game modifier designs and all that, the actual gameplay moment-to-moment of Gears of War Judgment is really not very good. Most of the levels are rather short, and a lot of them are just wave-based defense sections that feel like you're playing a much crappier version of the Horde survival multiplayer mode. And frankly, if people wanted to play the Horde survival multiplayer mode, they would just play the Horde survival multiplayer mode. They're not looking for that in a campaign. And yet, they take up a significant chunk of what is a relatively short campaign at about 5 to 6 hours long, depending on which difficulty setting you're playing on. The end result of all of this is that when you bring the entire Judgment campaign and all of its elements together, it ends up being a downright crappy single-player campaign that is easily the worst in the Gears of War franchise up to this point. I haven't played Gears 4 or 5 yet, so I can't tell you whether those are worse or not. But at the very least, out of the single-player campaigns of Gears of War 1, 2, 3, and Judgment, Judgment has the absolute worst one. And since you have to play through the Judgment campaign to unlock the Aftermath mini-campaign, you'd be forgiven for thinking that the Aftermath campaign is just going to be more of the same, when it turns out that it's not. It's actually very much in keeping with the previous Gears of War campaigns in terms of its structure and the mechanics, because it's a side story for Gears of War 3. There is a section in Gears of War 3 where Baird and Cole go off to get reinforcements, and that's not covered in Gears of War 3. The Aftermath mini-campaign in Gears of War Judgment tells the story of what they did in order to bring in reinforcements. So in this mini-campaign, you play as Baird throughout the entire thing, and he is accompanied by Cole as well as Clayton Carmine, and they make their way back to Halvo Bay, where Paddock and Sophia, spoiler alerts for the campaign of Judgment, I suppose, if you even care, had helped set up a community of people who were formerly associated with either the UIO or the COG, or even just independent in general, and were only focused on surviving. What ensues is your squad of 4 fighting your way through the city ruins in order to make your way up to an emulsion mining rig that had washed up after the destruction of Jacinto, in order to link up with Paddock's group so that they can help you get the ship and reinforcements you need in order to go off on the offensive in Gears of War 3. And while this mini-campaign is more in keeping with what we expect from Gears of War at this point, the more serious, gritty, apocalyptic fiction, albeit with Judgment's propensity for throwing one-liners in pretty much constantly, which is very jarring, and more importantly, a mechanically standard linear story campaign as opposed to the weird arcade mess that was the Judgment campaign. It just doesn't add much to the overall storyline, and it is very short. We're talking about an hour to an hour and a half long, depending on what difficulty setting you're playing on. It took me an hour and 17 minutes playing on the normal difficulty setting, and as you've seen throughout this video, I can't aim worth shit on gamepad controls. So chances are, if you're somebody who's been playing this franchise for a while, and you have gotten quite comfortable with the controls, it's gonna be on the shorter side of that. You're probably gonna be looking at more about an hour long. And with how little it adds to the overall franchise, with how little it adds to this game, in fact, and how much you have to play of the main Judgment campaign just to unlock the Aftermath mini-campaign, is just not worth playing through unless you are an absolute die-hard Gears of War fan, and if you're one of those, you've probably already played through Judgment and the Aftermath mini-campaign anyway. So when you bring all of that together, you end up with easily the worst single-player portion of any Gears of War game up to the release of Judgment, and just in general, a pretty crappy single-player experience. But what about the multiplayer? Well, that's hard to say, because this is an Xbox 360 game, and it never got re-released on any subsequent Xbox consoles, although you can still play this in backwards compatibility on Xbox One, and I would assume Xbox Series X and S as well, although I might be wrong on that. So Gears of War Judgment doesn't really have a player base anymore, meaning the only way you can experience multiplayer is through bot matches, which at least the game does have, so I can at least show you some multiplayer gameplay here. But while the AI might be perfectly fine for playing against in, say, a team deathmatch mode or something like that, the big gameplay mode that Judgment introduced, called Overrun, requires a lot of teamwork, and you're just not going to get that with the bots. The idea there is that it is a class-based game mode, so the COG have 4 classes: Engineer, Medic, Scout, and Soldier, and depending on which one you pick, you're playing as a different character. For example, if you're playing as Medic, you're playing as Sophia; if you're playing as Engineer, you're playing as Baird, so on and so forth. Whereas the Locusts have 2 different tiers, more or less, of classes, where you have basic stuff like Grenadiers, Wretches, Incantuses, and Tickers, and then the more advanced classes, Corpsers, Maulers, Ragers, and Ceripedes, that require points that you earn by playing the game, completing objectives, and that sort of thing in order to unlock. And the way it all works is that the COG are the defensive team, whereas the Locust are the attacking team. The COG are trying to defend objectives, which are either going to be emergence hole covers or generators, whereas the Locust are trying to destroy them. And unfortunately, it's not a mode you can really play in bot matches, because you have no way of coordinating with the bots themselves, so you just have to hope they behave in an optimal manner, and obviously they're not going to. But even just seeing how it works with the bots, I could see this being a very interesting mode to play with other players. It's just the game doesn't really have a player base anymore, and it wasn't included in Gears 4 or 5, so unfortunately Overrun just ends up being kind of a footnote in the series' history at this point, unless they bring it back later on. The other mode they introduced in Gears of War Judgment is Free-for-All, which is pretty much exactly what you would expect if you've played any other game that has a free-for-all mode. Not exactly anything to be excited about, let's put it that way. They did also make a few changes to the gameplay mechanics themselves, in addition to adding these two new modes, and the most significant changes are that there's no more down but not out in any of the modes except for execution. So you can't go down and then be revived, nor can you go down and then have an execution move performed on you. And they also removed the perfect active reload from multiplayer. There's still active reload, but you no longer get the perfect part of it where if you time it just right, then your first few shots of the next magazine, or the next shot if it's a single shot weapon, are going to be sort of supercharged. There was also another fairly major change where you get to choose what grenade you start with, but as far as I can tell, the most impactful ones are the perfect active reload removal, as well as the removal of down but not out, and from everything I've seen, the Gears of War fanbase were not happy with their removal. And when you bring all of this package together, it's pretty easy to see why the game sold as poorly as it did. They made very unpopular changes to the multiplayer, the campaign itself is an absolute mess, the Aftermath mini-campaign just doesn't add enough to be worth experiencing, and the real kicker is that they wanted full price for this. This was a full-priced release on launch, and between the new consoles coming out later the same year, and it being fairly obvious that Gears of War Judgment was, at absolute best, a DLC or expansion pack that they were trying to sell as a full standalone game, most people who were even aware of its existence at all, because it wasn't really all that well advertised either, would just take one look at it and say, yeah, no thanks, I'll stick with Gears of War 3 until the next mainline entry comes out. And they were absolutely justified in doing that, because as much as I don't care for the Gears of War franchise, it was on an upward trajectory of quality from the first game on up through Gears of War 3. And then Gears of War Judgment comes along, it's made by a completely different studio with some supervision from Epic Games instead of them being the main developer, and it just ended up being a pretty crappy game overall that frankly, I can't recommend to anybody unless you are an absolute die-hard fan of the Gears of War franchise, and even then, there's a very good chance you're not gonna like it. Ultimately, I give this a 2 out of 5. It is still a playable game at the end of the day. You could definitely do a lot worse than Gears of War Judgment, but if you're not a die-hard fan of the Gears of War franchise, or you're like me and you can't stand playing shooters on console, then there's really not a reason to play Gears of War Judgment at all. If they ever, for whatever baffling reason, do end up bringing it to PC, then even then, it's still not worth playing. You could at least make an argument for Gears of War 2 and 3 if they ever bring those to PC, but Gears of War Judgment, no, there's really no reason to play this one at all. Thank you all very much for watching, and for those of you who've been watching the channel for a while, thanks for bearing with me on how long it took this video to come out. I teased this one years ago in one of the yearly teasers, and it just ended up not happening until now. So sorry about how long that took, but I figured that since Gears of War E-Day is on the horizon, it was probably a good idea to go ahead and cover the games in the series that I have yet to cover. So, of course, Gears of War Judgment, but also Gears of War 4, 5, and Tactics, all of which I have copies of, but I just haven't gotten around to yet. And it'll certainly be interesting to see how differently Gears of War plays on PC versus console, because I never played the PC version of Gears of War 1 back in the day, and I certainly never played the Ultimate Edition either. So up until this point, I've basically been suffering through the Gears of War franchise since I just can't stand playing shooters on console in general. It's not specifically a Gears thing, it's a console shooters in general, whether it's first or third person. And that, of course, plays a strong role in why it has taken me so long to get this video out, because I'll take a look at a shooter on console and say, maybe I should cover some of these other PC games first. But thankfully, Gears of War Judgment was the last console-exclusive game in the franchise that I hadn't taken a look at yet, so from here on out, I should at least be able to play through the games without too much fuss. We'll see how it goes, though. Anyway, I've rambled enough, so thank you all again for watching, and if you like my channel, please consider supporting it on Patreon. If you can't afford to or don't want to, that's fine, I understand. But the option's there if you're interested, and every bit really helps out. You'd be amazed how even $1 a month can help out. Thanks again for watching, and I will see you all in later videos.